A secret meeting inside Parliament. A queen moving in the shadows. And a granddaughter of the late Queen Elizabeth, Princess Beatrice. Daring to expose it all. What was Camilla hiding? And why did it threaten the very future of the monarchy? Whispers began late in the evening, first as a rumor, then as a confirmed leak. Queen Camilla had entered Parliament under the guise of a private visit. There were no photographers, no official records, no ceremonial purpose attached to her presence. Instead, she met senior figures behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the press and the glare of tradition. For centuries, monarchs and their consorts have observed an unwritten line. Parliament was a space for governance, not for secret negotiations by royals. Yet Camilla had crossed it, deliberately and boldly, igniting questions about what was really being planned in those hidden chambers. This was no ceremonial visit. Those who knew of it insisted it was neither casual nor symbolic. It was calculated, strategic, and deeply political. The meeting reeked of intent, of a woman maneuvering pieces on a board few even realized she was playing upon. For years, Camilla had endured scrutiny, whispers of disapproval, and suspicions about her loyalty to the monarchy's traditions. But now, it seemed she had stepped into a role far more dangerous, that of a power broker. A queen, not content with titles, but desperate for influence. And it was Princess Beatrice, long overlooked, who ripped the curtain back on this hidden maneuver. For years, she had remained silent, her role in the royal hierarchy quiet, her presence overshadowed by William, Harry, and even Catherine. She was considered loyal, dutiful, but rarely disruptive. Yet here she was, standing against the queen consort herself, exposing the very meeting that could unravel the monarchy's fragile balance. In a single breath, Beatrice transformed from passive participant to active whistleblower, daring to shine light on the darkness Camilla hoped to keep hidden. The revelation sparked suspicion so intense it rippled far beyond the walls of the palace. Was Camilla attempting to bend Parliament's loyalty not toward the monarchy itself, but toward her own bloodline? Had she been negotiating favors for her family, positioning her children and grandchildren for royal relevance at the expense of William and his heirs? If true, the consequences would be nothing short of catastrophic. For in a monarchy built on order, precedence, and tradition, the idea of a queen consort seizing political influence was a betrayal not just of the king, but of the crown itself. And the timing was no coincidence. King Charles's health was faltering, his strength visibly waning with each public appearance. William was rising steadily, prepared to shoulder the responsibilities of the throne. The monarchy, in its most vulnerable state in decades, was left exposed, and Camilla had moved quickly to seize an advantage. With Charles weakened and William focused on steadying the ship, Camilla's secret steps into Parliament carried the weight of a woman racing against time, determined to secure power before it slipped from her grasp. Yet the most haunting question remained. Why was it Beatrice, of all people, who decided to expose this dangerous secret? What did she know, and what drove her to speak when so many others remained silent? Her voice, unexpected and daring, cracked open a story that threatened to engulf them all. But this wasn't just a casual conversation. It was a plot that had been building for years, and Beatrice's revelation was only the beginning. Behind her public smiles, Camilla was crafting a strategy of her own. Parliament wasn't just an audience, it was her weapon. For years, she had endured the shadow of scandal, the sting of whispers that followed her every step, the constant comparison to the late Princess Diana, whose legacy seemed eternal. To survive, Camilla had reinvented herself in the eyes of the public, carefully repairing an image once considered beyond redemption. She presented herself as dutiful, steady, and loyal to Charles, a woman who had finally earned her place beside the throne. But beneath that softened exterior, another plan had been slowly forming, a plan that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with power. Camilla knew that public approval was fragile. Smiles and ceremonies could vanish in an instant if the people sensed disloyalty. And so, she turned her eyes to something stronger, something less fleeting: Parliament. Unlike the adoration of crowds, political influence could not be snatched away overnight. To secure her family's future, she needed allies in the halls of power. The whispers began with invitations extended to carefully chosen members of Parliament, not at official banquets or grand events, but in discreet private rooms where conversations were hushed and no one dared speak of them openly. Camilla's intent was clear: to weave her family into the very fabric of the monarchy's machinery, using Parliament as her silent accomplice. Her strategy began small, almost imperceptible. First, she encouraged her relatives' increasing involvement in royal charities, quietly positioning them in roles that appeared harmless but carried immense symbolic weight. Each appointment, each handshake, each title whispered in the background was a move forward, an expansion of her bloodline's reach into spaces long reserved for those tied by centuries of Windsor lineage. Those who noticed grew uneasy, but few dared confront her directly. For Camilla, subtlety was her weapon, an inch here, a gesture there, until suddenly it became clear that her family stood closer to the crown than anyone had ever imagined. Still, the real gamble came when she began using Parliament itself as a forum. Quiet conversations, barely audible in the grand halls, hinted at promises and concerns. Leaks suggested she sought reassurances that, should Charles's health fail sooner than expected, her position and influence would not crumble with him. These murmurs, dismissed at first, grew bolder, painting the picture of a queen consort determined to rewrite her role in history. Charles's illness was her window, and she knew it. With the king weakened and increasingly withdrawn from the public eye, Camilla could act under the guise of necessity, stepping forward when he could not, speaking when his voice faltered. The illness gave her justification for presence and influence, a reason to stand before Parliament without question. But in truth, it was her chance to take what she had always wanted: unshakable authority. And yet, her moves were not hidden from everyone. William and Catherine had long sensed her restlessness. Each time she smiled beside them on the balcony, there was a tension just beneath the surface, an invisible line that neither side dared cross, but both felt pressing against their every word. Catherine, in particular, knew the danger of Camilla's growing confidence. For if Parliament sided with her, the legacy of Diana and the promise made to William and his children could be overshadowed by Camilla's ambition. Still, Camilla had chosen a perilous path. Parliament was no ordinary ally. Its halls were filled with shifting loyalties, political rivalries, and ambitions of its own. By seeking its favor, Camilla was not only gambling with her reputation, she was risking the monarchy itself. For once the whispers of political interference began, they could not easily be silenced. And yet, as Camilla plotted in silence, someone inside the palace had already begun to watch her every move. For years, Princess Beatrice stayed quiet, sidelined in royal drama. But when she saw what Camilla was planning, silence was no longer an option. Beatrice had built her life around discretion. She was never the headline grabber, never the one to spark controversy or stir division. Her name was associated with loyalty, a willingness to support the institution without demanding recognition. Unlike her cousins, she had rarely courted public sympathy or defied the unwritten rules that bound the royals together. This was her reputation: safe, steady, and unthreatening, which is precisely why her sudden break from silence carried such devastating force. For Beatrice, the burden of her mother Sarah Ferguson's past weighed heavily. She had seen firsthand how scandal could permanently taint a royal name. She lived through whispers, ridicule, and the endless press attacks that painted her family as reckless outsiders. It had instilled in her a cautious approach, one that made her hesitate to step into the spotlight for fear of reopening old wounds. But even as she tried to remain distant from the palace's most dangerous rivalries, Beatrice understood that staying quiet came at a cost. And when she stumbled across damning information about Camilla's secret dealings with Parliament, the weight of her silence grew unbearable. The story of how Beatrice came into possession of the notes remains cloaked in mystery. Some claim they were handed to her by a sympathetic aide who could no longer stomach the deception. Others whisper that Beatrice herself had begun keeping a close watch, suspicious of the queen consort's movements. What mattered was not how she got them, but what they revealed: records of Camilla's meeting with select MPs, laced with talk of succession, stability, and influence. Words that crossed the boundary between royal duty and dangerous ambition. In those notes, Beatrice saw a threat, not just to her cousin William, but to the monarchy itself. The discovery tore her apart. Every instinct told her to stay quiet, to avoid bringing another Ferguson-linked scandal into the spotlight. Her loyalty to her family and to the institution told her to bury what she had seen. But there was another force at play: duty. Duty to her grandmother's legacy, to the promise of a monarchy free from corruption, and to the generations that would inherit it. The conflict within her grew heavier with every passing day, until it became impossible to carry. In the end, Beatrice chose exposure over silence. Her decision shattered royal protocol, crossing a line no one expected her to touch. The monarchy thrives on secrecy, on keeping family disputes locked behind gilded walls. By stepping out of the shadows, Beatrice not only defied Camilla, she defied the very rules of survival the royal family had lived by for centuries. And in doing so, she set fire to the palace corridors. The whispers began immediately. Staff traded nervous glances. Aides scrambled to contain what they feared might erupt into scandal. For the first time, Camilla's carefully polished image cracked under the pressure of exposure, and all eyes turned to Beatrice, the quiet princess, who had suddenly found her voice. But what Beatrice revealed was only a glimpse. The true depth of Camilla's plan would soon send shockwaves far beyond Westminster. What was said behind closed doors? The whispers from that meeting hint at a plan so bold it could alter the monarchy forever. Parliament, a place bound by protocol and history, suddenly became the stage for a queen consort's ambition. Reports began to surface, quiet at first, then louder, as Beatrice's revelation forced them into the light. Camilla had pressed members of Parliament on matters that no consort should ever touch. The conversations, far from ceremonial pleasantries, were filled with talk of succession, stability, and the shifting balance of power inside the monarchy. What was meant to be hidden behind oak doors and hushed corridors now dripped into the public domain, raising alarm in every corner of the palace. The details were unsettling. Camilla, according to those who were present, positioned herself as the monarchy's steady hand, the one who could guide the institution while Charles battled illness and William struggled under the mounting expectations of a future king. She spoke not as a silent partner but as a figure of authority, suggesting that in the storm of uncertainty, she alone could guarantee continuity. To some, it was persuasive, even comforting. But to others, it was chilling, the unmistakable sign of a consort pushing beyond her role into territory that risked dismantling centuries of order. The sharpest suspicion grew around one question. Was Camilla angling for her grandson's future inside the monarchy? Whispers claimed she had hinted at it, cloaked in careful language, but clear enough to spark outrage. The idea that she could use Parliament to subtly elevate her bloodline at the expense of William and Catherine's children was unthinkable. Yet the fact it was even suggested tore through the palace like fire. To the old guard, it was the gravest betrayal imaginable, a consort daring to reconfigure succession for her own family's gain. Not all who heard her were repelled. Some MPs, weary of instability, admired her boldness. They believed her experience and composure could be a safeguard in turbulent times. But others were livid. To them, Camilla's words crossed a sacred boundary. Parliament was not to be used as a bargaining chip for personal power. The monarchy's stability rested on tradition, not private negotiations in hidden chambers. By daring to frame herself as indispensable, Camilla revealed a dangerous hunger for influence that could fracture the very institution she claimed to defend. Beatrice's disclosure added weight to these whispers. Her words stripped away the illusion that Camilla's presence in Parliament had been ceremonial. It was political, calculated, and deliberate. What she exposed made it impossible for the palace to dismiss the meeting as harmless. It wasn't about supporting Charles in his illness, nor was it about reinforcing the dignity of the crown. It was about power raw, undisguised, and reaching for a future in which Camilla's voice would not fade with the king's. For Charles and William, the act was seen as nothing less than betrayal. To the king, it was a violation of trust, his wife using his frailty as cover for her own ambitions. To William, it was sabotage, an attempt to undermine the destiny laid upon his shoulders since birth. The whispers that escaped Parliament's walls made clear what Beatrice had already risked her reputation to reveal. This was no misunderstanding. It was an attempted rewrite of the monarchy's future. And yet, as the truth began to leak, Camilla's mask began to crack, and the royal family prepared for war. When William and Catherine learned of Camilla's meeting, their silence turned to fury. For them, this wasn't just betrayal, it was sabotage. The timing alone was devastating. With Charles's health faltering, William was already burdened with the crushing weight of preparing for kingship sooner than expected. He had stepped quietly but firmly into his father's role, managing affairs, meeting dignitaries, and balancing the expectations of a nation that saw him as the inevitable successor. To discover that, in the middle of this delicate transition, Camilla had taken her schemes to Parliament was not just an insult, It was a direct attempt to weaken his position before he even had the chance to sit on the throne. Catherine saw it for what it truly was: a threat to her children. As the mother of George, Charlotte, and Louis, her entire focus was on securing the future of the line that Diana had given her life to protect. Camilla's backroom dealings looked like the opening moves of a dangerous game meant to push aside William's rightful heirs. For Catherine, there was no forgiveness in this. Every step Camilla took into Parliament's halls echoed as an assault on her children's birthright. Her protective instincts sharpened into fury, the kind that would not be calmed with apologies or excuses. Behind palace doors, the couple's anger could not be contained. They confronted their most trusted aides, demanding answers as to how Camilla's maneuver had gone unnoticed until Beatrice exposed it. There were reports of heated exchanges, of William's voice raised in a way rarely seen by those around him, and of Catherine's calm but cutting words that made clear the gravity of the betrayal. They believed the monarchy was at a tipping point, and that those closest to them had failed to guard against the very plot they feared most. For William, every move Camilla made reopened old wounds tied to his mother's suffering. The memory of Diana haunted this moment. It was as though Camilla, the woman who had once been at the center of his mother's heartbreak, was now haunting his own reign before it began. Each whisper of her ambition felt like a shadow of the past, stretching across the present, threatening to repeat the same tragedy in a different form. The symbolism was inescapable, and it cut deeper than politics. It was personal, visceral, and impossible to ignore. Catherine, meanwhile, became the steady force William needed most. While her husband burned with anger, she reminded him that strength and moral clarity would always outweigh manipulation and secrecy. To Catherine, Camilla's ambition was reckless, dangerous, and destined to collapse under the weight of its own deceit. Yet, she knew the damage could not be undone without action. It was no longer enough to remain the dignified future queen. Catherine had to be the moral counterweight, the living example of what the monarchy was meant to embody. And so the tension grew, simmering like a storm trapped within gilded walls. Every glance exchanged at official events, every pause in the corridors, carried the unspoken knowledge that a confrontation was coming. It would not remain hidden forever. The silence, once their shield, had turned into a prison of unvoiced fury, and the cracks were already beginning to show. But even as William prepared to defend his crown, Camilla's allies inside the palace were already moving against him. The palace was no longer one family. It was two rival courts, each plotting in whispers, each bracing for the storm. The cracks that had long been hidden beneath layers of ceremony and carefully staged appearances were now splitting open for all to see. What began as a secret meeting had spiraled into a crisis of trust so deep that no bond, no shared memory, seemed strong enough to mend it. At the heart of it all stood a monarchy divided, its members no longer united by duty, but driven apart by suspicion, resentment, and ambition. Princess Anne found herself caught in the middle of the chaos. Fiercely loyal to her brother Charles, she had always stood as his shield, a constant defender of his reign. Yet even Anne could not ignore the troubling signs around Camilla. Anne's instincts told her something was off, that Camilla's bold maneuvering had gone far beyond what was acceptable. Still, her devotion to Charles weighed heavily, leaving her torn between defending her brother's choice of partner and protecting the institution she had served all her life. The conflict gnawed at her, forcing her to remain silent in public, while privately questioning whether her loyalty was being tested to the breaking point. Prince Edward, in contrast, held little doubt. He had watched William mature into a leader, and he recognized the stability William and Catherine offered to a monarchy on the brink of collapse. Quietly but firmly, Edward aligned himself with William's vision of the crown's future. He did not shout or grandstand. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, lending his support in subtle but unmistakable ways. To him, Camilla's actions were not just reckless, they were destructive. And in his view, the monarchy's survival depended on ensuring William, not Camilla's influence, defined the next chapter. For Beatrice, however, the price of truth became isolation. Her revelation had lit the fuse, but the consequences were now bearing down upon her. Whispers labeled her disloyal, reckless, and naive. Courtiers who once welcomed her presence now turned cold. Even those sympathetic to her feared being associated with her outburst. Yet, despite the backlash, Beatrice stood her ground. She had chosen to reveal what others dared to hide, And though the burden left her alone in the gilded halls, she refused to retreat. Her courage, however, only deepened the rift, making her both a target of resentment and a symbol of defiance. And then there was Andrew. Always on the fringe, tainted by scandal, he now saw opportunity in the turmoil. With Camilla weakened by exposure and William locked in confrontation, Andrew lingered in the shadows, calculating how chaos might open doors once closed to him. He was not aligned with principle, but with self-preservation. And to him, the storm was not a danger, but a chance to regain relevance. His presence only added to the sense that the monarchy was unraveling, each member pursuing their own interest at the expense of unity. The fracture was undeniable. Not since the days of Diana had the royal family appeared so broken. But this time, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was institutional collapse. The people saw it too. Newspapers and tabloids fanned the flames, seizing every whisper, every gesture, every rumor. The nation began to murmur in unison, if the family could not trust each other, how could the public trust the crown? The monarchy, once a symbol of endurance, now teetered on the edge of implosion. The unity that had carried it through wars, scandals, and abdications was crumbling, and what remained was a battlefield of rival courts locked in silent combat. And then came the moment no one expected, the confrontation that would spill from Parliament's shadows into the palace itself. It happened in hushed corridors, away from cameras. Camilla and Beatrice finally stood face to face. The silence in that gilded hallway carried more weight than any roar of the public outside. This was no casual encounter, no polite exchange of royal courtesies. It was the moment when two women, separated by generation, but bound by legacy, confronted each other over the fate of the monarchy itself. Tension radiated from every word unspoken, every glance unbroken, as the whispers of Parliament's secret dealings now collided with the raw force of truth. Camilla struck first, her voice low but laced with venom. To her, Beatrice had committed the ultimate betrayal, breaking the unspoken oath of silence that protected the family from its own scandals. She accused Beatrice of treachery, of placing personal ambition above the crown, of siding with those who would weaken the monarchy rather than defend it. But Beatrice stood firm, her composure sharpened by conviction. She knew this confrontation was inevitable, and she had prepared for the moment when the consort herself would demand answers. Instead of retreat, Beatrice invoked the one name that even Camilla could not easily dismiss, Queen Elizabeth II. With steady resolve, she framed her actions as a duty to her grandmother's legacy. She reminded Camilla that the late queen had dedicated her life to upholding the purity of the crown, never bending its traditions to serve her own desires, never using it as a tool for personal gain. To betray that legacy, Beatrice declared, was to betray the monarchy itself. And if exposing Camilla's actions placed her at odds with the queen consort, then so be it. The exchange sent shockwaves through the staff, who bore witness to it. They described a scene unlike any they had ever seen inside the palace, an atmosphere so charged with fury and defiance that even the most seasoned aides froze in place, unwilling to interrupt. For decades, the monarchy had thrived on control, on containing disputes behind velvet curtains. But here, control had slipped. The clash was out in the open, unrestrained, and irreversible. Camilla's fury deepened. She defended her actions with insistence, claiming that what she had done was not for ambition, but for stability. With Charles weakened and the monarchy facing uncertainty, she argued that her conversations with Parliament were meant to ensure continuity, not chaos. Yet even as she spoke, the words rang hollow. To her critics, stability sounded like a shield for manipulation, a mask for her hunger to shape the monarchy in her own image. Beatrice, under relentless pressure, refused to bend. Every attempt by Camilla to silence her only strengthened her resolve. Her voice carried the weight of a generation that still remembered Elizabeth's reign, a generation unwilling to let the monarchy be reshaped in shadows and secrecy. In that moment, it was no longer just Beatrice versus Camilla. It was a granddaughter of Elizabeth standing against the queen consort, two women embodying two visions of royalty colliding at the heart of the crown. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. One represented memory and integrity, the other ambition and survival. And as their words clashed in the quiet of the palace, the echoes were felt far beyond those walls. This was more than a personal confrontation. It was the monarchy itself tearing in two. But the palace was no longer in control. The storm was spilling into the streets, and the people were ready to choose sides. When news of Beatrice's exposé broke, the nation reacted with disbelief and fury. It spread like wildfire, igniting front pages and dominating broadcasts across the world. Headlines blared in bold, unforgiving ink. Camilla's secret parliament dealings. The quiet whispers of hidden power had now become a deafening roar. And for the first time in decades, the monarchy itself seemed to tremble under the weight of public outrage. What had once been confined to hushed corridors and silent glances was now the subject of every conversation in every household, cafe, and street corner. The people felt betrayed, and they wanted answers. The reaction was immediate and visceral. To the public, the idea that the Queen Consort had entered Parliament not for ceremony but for shadowy negotiations was nothing short of an outrage. For centuries, the monarchy had survived on the fragile trust that it would remain above politics, a symbol of unity, untarnished by personal gain. But Camilla's alleged plotting shattered that illusion. Backroom deals, whispers of succession, suggestions of elevating her bloodline, all struck at the very heart of what people believed the monarchy stood for. Outrage poured onto the streets, with chants demanding accountability echoing outside the very gates of Buckingham Palace. Polls revealed a dramatic shift. Sympathy swelled for William and Catherine, whose steady presence was suddenly cast as the antidote to corruption. They became the faces of hope. The couple burdened by responsibility, yet seemingly untouched by the games of manipulation. The public's loyalty tilted sharply in their direction, and every appearance they made was greeted with cheers of support. Meanwhile, Camilla's reputation crumbled in real time. Once tolerated, even tentatively respected by some, she was now painted as manipulative, her image unraveling with each new revelation. The careful work she had built over years dissolved overnight under the weight of scandal. And at the center of it all stood Beatrice. The princess, who had once been overlooked and underestimated, was suddenly hailed as a heroine. She was cast as the brave voice who refused to stay silent, the whistleblower who had risked everything to defend the truth. The nation, weary of secrecy, embraced her as a symbol of courage. Crowds even began chanting her name alongside William and Catherine's, as though she too had stepped into a role far larger than the one she was ever meant to play. Her decision to break protocol had made her a lightning rod of hope, an unexpected guardian of the crown's integrity. The fury did not remain confined to newspapers and polls. Crowds swelled outside the palace gates, waving banners, demanding statements, and calling for answers from the highest levels of the monarchy. The air thickened with tension, the atmosphere turning from uneasy curiosity to outright defiance. The palace, once a fortress of control, was now surrounded by voices it could no longer ignore. Every hour that passed without a response only deepened the divide, pushing the monarchy closer to a crisis it could no longer contain. And just as the fury reached its peak, King Charles himself was forced to make a choice. In his frailty, King Charles spoke, and his words would decide the fate of the monarchy. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, torn between devotion to his wife and the unbreakable duty to the institution he had sworn to uphold. Advisors, with urgency in their voices, pressed him to distance himself from Camilla, warning that her secret dealings had poisoned not only her image, but the stability of the throne itself. Charles wrestled with heartbreak, for to acknowledge the truth was to admit that Parliament, the very body meant to protect the monarchy's balance, had been weaponized by the woman closest to him. When he finally addressed the nation, his words were measured but unflinching. He vowed to protect tradition, to guard the crown from political interference, and to preserve the sanctity of succession. Camilla's influence shattered before the public eye, her humiliation sealed not by gossip, but by the king's own declaration. And in the quiet that followed, Beatrice, once overlooked, stood as an unlikely guardian of truth, her courage reshaping the monarchy's course. But even as Charles's words echoed, the question remained: had the monarchy truly silenced Camilla, or was this only the beginning of another storm? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.